Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi, and this week in my Prince Ion China column, I covered the Chinese discourse. What are the Chinese discussing about the just concluded so called negotiation Islamabad on the US Iran Israel war? And what are they discussing about Chinese role in it and what is next for the conflict? So, of course, the latest round of negotiations between the US and Iran that were held in Islamabad has ended without a deal. And I think by most accounts, I would call it a failure. But if you look at how this is being discussed in China on the Chinese internet within Chinese discourse, the story sounds very, very different. So let me begin with what the Chinese media and online platforms are saying. So the dominant view is that tensions in the Strait of Hormuz were driven largely by the US and Israeli actions. There were unilateral actions to escalate tensions by the US and Israel, and that these have put serious pressure. There are serious repercussions on global energy markets. And then there is also a sense that Washington is increasingly isolated. Uh, Apart from Israel, most US allies and partners have stayed relatively quiet, while relatively, in fact, muted, while European countries have stressed the need to keep this strait open. But then, on the other hand, the Chinese view is that Russia has also warned about the risk to global markets and more aligned with China and countries that are speaking against the US. Now, what is really interesting is how China's role is being discussed and is being framed. So, in Chinese discussions, Beijing is everywhere in the background, mostly as the invisible hand. China was not really on the table, but in the discussion, China was everywhere. The idea is that China is playing a restrained yet important and a constructive role. And this role is usually described in three ways on the Chinese by the Chinese commentators. First, China is staying in contact, constant communication with all the sides, mostly US and Iran. And it is second, it is quietly mediating. And third, it is carefully balancing its position. And then there is also some skepticism about US intentions. For example, when US President Donald Trump said the US was clearing the Strait of Hormuz as a benefit to the world, as a gift to the world, including countries such as China. So some of the Chinese commentators did not really take that at face value. Instead, they saw it as Washington playing the China card. Basically, what they said is that what the US is trying to do is to frame China as a beneficiary and maybe even expecting something in return, maybe some political leverage by making China more grateful for what the US is doing to, perceivably doing to open the Strait of Hormuz. So, some also argue that the US is trying to create distance between China and Iran, mainly to build mistrust in Tehran while gaining leverage for future talks. And at the same time, Chinese analysts also highlight their own diplomatic efforts. For example, what they highlighted that Foreign Minister Wang Yi made at least 26 calls. He has been very active, and China's Middle East envoy has also been engaged very proactively. And Beijing, along with Islamabad, has put forward peace proposal. So the emphasis is on Beijing is working along with Islamabad. So the message is fairly straightforward here that China wants to be seen as a responsible, stabilizing actor and stakeholder. So now, one phrase that comes up frequently and is quite telling of what China is thinking about the US and about its own role, that China is not really taking sides, but it is building a ladder. And in other words, it is actually positioning itself as a country that helps other step back from conflict, and it is really playing an important role. This is what the projection is from the Chinese side. And in fact, there are even claims on the Chinese internet, though of course not verified, that back channel communication involving Beijing actually helped keep the talks from collapsing. uh, some accounts suggest that China played a role in ensuring the safety of the Iranian delegation, possibly using its influence with Washington. But more broadly, China's approach is being described as working behind the scenes. So, behind the scene efforts are something that are being talked about on the Chinese internet, while letting Pakistan take the more visible role. And there are a few reasons for that. First, of course, the energy. We have talked about energy so much, and this is the buzzword now, that around 20% of global seaborne oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. So, instability there, of course, directly impacts China and the countries across the world. Then, second, of course, is diplomacy by emphasizing things like the UN Charter and multilateralism. China is presenting itself as a rules based actor, a country that is following international law. And this is something that is very different from what it calls the US unilateralism. And third is strategy. So, by staying in the background, China can actually shape outcomes without taking on too much risk. Now, on the conflict itself, Chinese scholars are quite explicit on this front. For example, Shan Yi, who is professor of international politics at Fudan University, argues that the US and Israel expected a quick outcome in Iran. And that outcome was, of course, the regime destabilization, regime change in Iran, but that assumption proved wrong. So there was this misplaced optimism, according to Shani. But what happened instead was Iran sustained its response with missiles and drones, disrupted shipping routes, and turned the conflict into a prolonged stalemate. And what Shan says is that this has created a strategic deadlock for the US, where it cannot really declare a victory, and also at the same time, it cannot also easily withdraw at this point of time. And deeper military involvement would also carry serious risks. That actually proves that US is actually in a deadlock and US is actually suffering. Similarly, Niu Xinchun, who is director of China Arab State Research Institute at Ningxia University, argues that both the US and Israel underestimated Iran's resilience. And he outlines four possible trajectories of the war. The first is a negotiated settlement, second, a unilateral US exit, third, a prolonged conflict, or fourth is further escalation. Then there is Huang Cheng, distinguished professor at Shanghai International Studies University, who emphasized a broader point here. He suggests that China is increasingly emerging as a stabilizing force in global politics, and that its commitment towards stable US China relations has wider implications for global order and development. Um, but then there is a bigger takeaway in Chinese commentary. Some commentators and analysts argue that this conflict and the US performance actually show why there could not be a direct US China confrontation or conflict in the next 50 years. It is actually unlikely anytime soon. And why? The reasoning is that the war has exposed limits in the US military capacity, rising cost, and constraint from both allies and domestic politics. And in fact, what they're also projecting is that Iran has actually emerged stronger than. Finally, there's how China's role all in this being framed. A lot of discussion suggests that Iran came to the negotiating table largely because of Chinese influence, Chinese intervention. Of course, this is something that China has not really accepted and has been vocal about. And at the same time, Pakistan's role is often being downplayed if you look at the discussion in Chinese social media, mostly by the commentators who go by anonymous. Names portrayed more. So, in this um, perspective, Pakistan is portrayed more as a facilitator and is not really seen as an independent mediator. So, this narrative actually works in China's favor. It allows Beijing to appear more decisive and more influential while at the same time still staying in the background. And that may be the most important takeaway here, that China is still very much present on the table, but not really visible. So China does not need to be at the center of the stage to shape the outcome. What is happening right now, it is increasingly comfortable working from the sidelines. And what it is doing, it is projecting influence without taking on the full burden or responsibility. And here's where the Pakistan role of being a proxy mediator comes handy for China. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.